Suicide Squad. It's actually a pretty ancient DC comic series, but has seen a lot more recent play and coverage with the launch of not just one film, but two. One being not so loved, and the other being quite serviceable, with James Gunn at the helm. But the unique anti-hero villain-focused comic spin-off had very little in the way of video games. Sure, the Suicide Squad had made some appearances in other Arkham or Batman games, but they hadn't really made much of a serious appearance. While Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, developed by Rocksteady Studios and published by Warner Bros. Games, just launched in February of 2024, the title had actually been slowly in the works for 14 years before that. After facing multiple cancellations, changing of developers, and many other controversies, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League would finally launch much later, and to a resounding dud. In fact, the game has been worsely received, probably more than any other superhero live service game that we have covered, especially even Marvel Avengers. On this episode of Death of a Game, a series where we take a timeline, gather the most important clues and bits of evidence, and diagnose the largest contributing factors to a game or company's death, we are covering none other than the much talked about, and rarely in a positive light, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. Pay attention to the clues along the way, and if you missed any, don't worry, at the end of the episode, all will be revealed during the final deduction. And so, we kill the Justice League. This video is sponsored by Monly, who is currently offering a fantastic 96% off lifetime access using the link on screen or in the description. Monly is a language learning app that gives you access to 41 different languages from 33 native languages, resulting in a total of 1,320 language combinations. So if you want to learn English as a Romanian, or even less popular languages such as Catalan or Finnish, you can do so with the Monly app. Another great aspect of Monly is it utilizes real conversations with the help of a chatbot with speech recognition that can help you immediately. But don't worry, the lessons and audio material are recorded with native speakers to ensure authenticity. With the use of daily lessons and weekly and monthly quizzes, Monly focuses on practical lessons that you can actually use in your everyday life. At the end of each month, users can then take a quiz to recap what they have learned. Monly is currently hosting a spring sale, providing a 96% discount for lifetime access to all languages if you access the sale through the link on screen or in the description. Thank you to Monly for sponsoring this video and helping us pay our bills. While I'm not the biggest superhero fan or guy in the know, I had to do a lot of research to get me prepared to cover DC Comics, which besides the Arkham games has basically been an empty genre in terms of video games. That's right, Batman, like usual, has been carrying DC, especially in the way of video games, with multiple successful games to name. But although Suicide Squad only enters some of our brains like mine in the past couple of years, the spin-off comic series, where a group of supervillains are tasked with near impossible tasks to save the world, is actually quite an old series. Sometimes older series can seem like a relic in current times, because series like Suicide Squad were invented when print was the only thing that existed. With the world so digital these days, although comics are still very much around, they are a bit more niche, and about more collecting these days. Still, many of these old comic series, like Marvel's X-Men First Class for example, have had some massive successes when brought to the modern world in the form of film. Suicide Squad would be teased first in the video game world as far back as July 2010, when esteemed DC comic writer Jeff, or as we say in Texas, Geoff Johns, would tease it at a comic panel. Suicide Squad would remain dormant for 2 more years before Jeff would mention it again in an interview with Kotaku. We're working on Suicide Squad, it's in development right now. The team book where supervillains take on ultra-dangerous government espionage missions that they're not expected to come back from is on the DC Entertainment slate as both a movie and a video game. The article states, I'm really super excited about it because of the concept, and you have a game where any of the lead characters can conceivably die and it's not a stunt. Some really cool story could come out of that. Suicide Squad 4 years later, well at least WB Montreal's version of the game, would be reportedly cancelled December 19th, 2016. The article would continue that the focus was shifted to Batman instead, which kind of makes sense considering it had been the moneymaker, right? But we can look into it at least somewhat. The idea that Suicide Squad was cooking as an idea since 2010 and was cancelled already as late as 2016 just certainly seemed like a bad omen. But it seemed like DC was dedicated to getting Suicide Squad out there regardless, including in video game form, and part of me wishes that was because they just felt like it was a story that had to be told. But with the gift of hindsight, well, we just know that that's probably not true. Suicide Squad will be announced again, this time in a different iteration dubbed Kill the Justice League. While on the nose is basically what Suicide Squad is all about. Reportedly, the title was set to be an action-adventure cooperative title allowing you to play solo or with up to 4 players. Each squad member has their own unique moveset, with traversal abilities to freely explore the open world of Metropolis, along with a variety of weapons to customize and skills to master. Story-wise, it follows Harley Quinn, Deadshot, Captain Boomerang, and King Shark, who must take on an impossible mission to save the Earth and kill the world's DC superheroes. It was sounding a lot like a classic movie famous IP turned video game action-adventure game, with an expensive budget to boot, but going multiplayer was certainly a unique wrinkle, while depending on your view of unique. Considering this was Rocksteady, who was not known for multiplayer titles, many fans were worried about the multiplayer shift. At this point of development, many of the original talented development team, responsible for the successful Arkham series, was still present. With the industry obsession with live service though, could Warner Bros. Make the mistake of forcing a square peg into a round hole, thus losing one of the most talented teams ever? The supposed 2022 launch wouldn't happen, however, with Suicide Squad being delayed. As the article explains, at this point it was one of the most anticipated releases, so any further delays would just continue to worry the fans. The delay hadn't been official, but reported by those that were familiar with the development behind the scenes stuff. Suicide Squad will be delayed yet again, or maybe this was the official announcement, this time pushing into 2024, making it the 3rd delay that the game had faced that we know about, and 2 extra years the game had been pushed back, if not counting when it was an idea, incubating even. This delay was reportedly due to the game needing more polish, which although that's kind of for the most part a fair and PC answer to give, at this point facing multiple delays and having nearly no viewable game footage was gonna be worrying. The big long-awaited gameplay reveal for Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League would happen November 15th, 2023. Rocksteady would release 20 minutes of tailored gameplay and trailer footage, where they would explain the mechanics in the game and what to expect. While I think that this is actually a pretty intelligent way to unveil your game, at this point the game was supposed to be launching rather soon, as in like months. And I think a much better way, one that builds way more confidence and trust, is just having an open beta test that allows for anyone to sign up to test a game. The fact that they didn't go for an approach closer to that, I think blatantly exhibits that perhaps they had something to hide. The gameplay showcased wasn't bad enough though. The traversal attacks and movement abilities made the game pretty exciting to watch, and hopefully play. The slightly odd thing though was every character's reliance on guns and utilizing different kinds of guns. Now guns are kind of boring for most comic book and superhero fans, because they're usually what the opposition of the hero or villain kind of has to deal with. Sort of a minor nuisance if you will. Think of that amazing scene with Magneto disabling all of the guns and the bullets, or Superman just like bouncing bullets off of him. It's kind of what makes superheroes' mythos so unique because of how little effective traditional weapons are against them. Watching Deadshot fly around and then just shoot people with a regular gun kind of makes sense since it matches his identity a little bit, but I think more in the way of following like a bounty hunter Boba Fett would have made a lot more sense than like an SMG gunner. But seeing King Shark and like Harley Quinn doing the same thing was puzzling to say the least. Still, if the gunplay was good enough and the story progression was quality, I think there would still be enough there for some to find success. A big part of the discussion with the upcoming launch of SSKJL was, would the game be playable offline? If you failed the room temperature IQ test, you're probably asking in the comments now, or complaining about why am I covering a single player game? Well first, the game is multiplayer with a single player. The catch is that the single player requires you to be connected online to play, like all live service games. To curb some of this pushback, since the audience by 2023 was well conditioned to this, Rocksteady would announce an offline mode, but that it would be available later on, at some point. This was exactly what one of the other live service titles that we covered in the series did as well, and in the end, they took years to deliver on that promise. Would Rocksteady or Warner Bros. Games actually deliver on the promise? Well, as of the end of April 2024, they have yet to. But if not, the game, much like Marvel Avengers, could have its roadmap and thus future content just canned. Or worse, taking the server's offline period, which would kill a single-player game. In a shocking turn of events, though probably not to many of those watching now, the founders behind Rocksteady would leave the company and found their own company dubbed 100 Star Games. While this happening is not totally shocking in video game development, in fact it happens a lot, the reason it was so shocking was twofold. For starters, they hadn't even launched their upcoming game yet. And second, if you read the website for the new company, it almost reads like it's specifically created as a response to having to deal with outside hands and money ruining your game or vision. There were a lot of rumors that Rocksteady was set to work on a Superman game as well, and was pushed to work on a Suicide Squad game instead, a live service one I should add. My issue with that idea is that, well, why wouldn't that other Superman game have had the same kind of issues as like Marvel Avengers? I guess the idea is that maybe they wouldn't have had to make it multiplayer, but I just don't know if that's true. It just seems like Warner Brothers is quite addicted to live service right now despite not having that much success doing it. I think as leaving the company and forming a literal new company basically shows is that Warner Brothers Games and their issue with Rocksteady, at least the OG team, was based on making a live service game and not a Suicide Squad game. More controversy would occur, with a reported review embargo existing, well at least in the way of them never having given out review copies in the first place. I have only ever really seen this happen when developers or publishers are just worried that if journalists play their game, they're gonna broadcast it to everybody that it's just not very good. The worst part of this though is that the early access launch, which required an additional $30 charge on your pre-order to access, was supposed to launch in just 2 days. That early access launch would happen January 29th, 2024, but immediately upon launch, the servers would be brought offline. This made the game completely unplayable for all players, no matter if you're trying to play the game single player or multiplayer. This was basically a worst case scenario for the game, already plaguing them right out of the gate. Please visit our Patreon or donate on the next live stream, done on Wednesdays mainly, or become a member to show your support too. We don't make content based on views, and the support that we get allows us to do more outside of the Death of a Game series and in person at things like conventions and events and more, and the less that we have to take videos like dedicated sponsors. Make sure to visit our discord.gg/nerdslayer as well to join the community of like-minded gaming nerds and virtual world detectives, and communicate and even get to know me, Ines. Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League would launch on all platforms February 2nd, 2024, and from 90 critical reviews would struggle to even garner a 60 out of 100 on Metacritic. According to Steam, the game would only sell a few 100,000 copies, which for a game that reportedly cost at least $100 million to make, wasn't enough to recoup losses, let alone convince the publisher to keep making more content. Many of the expectations, the worst ones even, seem to be right about Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. The game, although absolutely gorgeous looking, especially in the set pieces, felt incredibly vapid and just lacked connection. The gameplay consisted of progressing through the story, through different zones and threats until reaching different boss fights against the Justice League themselves. The boss fights are easily the highlight of the game, and that's not really saying that much when nearly all of them take place in dome-like structures where you fell the JL members by, you guessed it, shooting them in the face. How anticlimactic. It wouldn't be so bad if the whole idea of guns to characters like Superman and Green Lantern aren't so trivial. I mean, Superman's whole gimmick is being resistant to bullets and being as fast as one. Sure, some characters like Flash make a huge appearance in the game and sort of redeem some of the lame aspects of the other characters not, but in a weird sense, even if the plot isn't that crazy for DC standards, because the gameplay is not very satisfying, it just kind of mutes a lot of the feelings that you do experience when you actually manage to fell a JL member, for example. Although counterculture series and ideas are pretty cool, and I mean heck, even villains can be very popular, like Magneto, my favorite. And sometimes anti-heroes can be the focus, like in Punisher. The issue with the JL members being felled the way that they're felled, though, is that often it's just quite easily done. These characters are near deity-like characters that have massive cult followings. That means if you don't handle even their deaths correctly, you can anger a bunch of those fans. Compare this to how god deaths are handled in a game like God of War. It's an entire ordeal to fell a god in God of War. Because the main cast of characters are selfish criminals, it's a bit hard to also make them entirely likable, which is a hard contrast with Amanda Waller, who's your boss in Suicide Squad and is basically a psychopath, greater good type character. Amanda is not at all likable despite a good voice acting performance by Deborah Wilson, which is fine, because she doesn't necessarily have to be. The problem is that most of the villains are so nonchalant about their villainy or nature, having been themselves for quite a while, it's hard to really attach to any particular character in the game and feel much of a connection. Contrast this with playing the Arkham series where you really do feel like you are Batman. I'm Batman. Maybe some of this is due to the swappable character nature, but even then, they almost had a good idea, but just didn't fully flesh it out, at least in my opinion. Each character has unique traversal attacks and melees, but after you initiate the combat, basically kind of play the same way. Many people, myself included, are puzzled why Rocksteady didn't just commit to making unique characters and giving them unique weapons. For example, maybe King Shark is melee only, but makes up for it because he's so strong and survivable. It just seemed like the ideas all died when they decided to make it just gunfighting and make gunfighting the majority of the way that you combat your enemies. And you can even see that in the finale as you just pew Superman in the face. Sigh. Destructoid, who rated the game a 6 out of 10, had similar thoughts to me regarding much of the game not being half bad, but feeling like it's shoved into a bad and boring parcel. As I stated previously, there is something splendid under it all. The Suicide Squad sports a cast of distinct kits and charming designs, but it's all awash in a world they can't play in. The writing is good, excellent even, but it's stuck in a game plagued by live service annoyances. It's a title that's not offensive enough to hate, but it brings nothing new to the table and has a slow start. It would have been a better game with a higher score had it introduced more variety with its enemies, was less monotonous when it comes to missions, and handled its live services a little bit more smartly. Alas, we're left with a title that teeters on the edge of being good, but never quite gets there. IGN would rate Suicide Squad a 5 out of 10 and state in their review that Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League is a thoroughly frustrating game to play. There are things to enjoy here, with combat that's snappy enough to carry it through a genuinely good DC Comics story artfully dressed in high production values, but everything else just falls down around it. Engaging mission design is nearly non-existent, the looter-shooter mechanics are tired and dull, and the grotesquely repetitive post-game leaves little to nothing to do of interest. The result is a bit of a mess that doesn't ever impress with any of its numerous ill-conceived ideas. It's not bad, it's just disappointing from Rocksteady, pioneers of single-player story action chasing already outdated multiplayer trends. The core of Suicide Squad, the missions, and the continuity of the scenes in the story, and the progression behind all of it as a looter-shooter of sorts, was just being quite poorly received. The lack of continuity in the plot and gameplay make the narrative just feel less punchy despite it not being that bad. These were going to be some difficult things to solve. Anthem, another live service title we covered, also suffered heavily from similar issues, and never made anything close to a comeback from them, despite promises otherwise. And that's the issue ultimately with live service games. If you can't convince those in charge you are worth keeping alive, you need lots of players playing the game for that, and your eventual, even if promised, content is very likely to get cancelled. Because why would they continue on that trajectory if they think it's not going to go anywhere, aka make them money? And that's not even me defending live service, just explaining it, and how volatile it actually is, including in the early months of a game's launch. Things weren't looking good for the long-delayed looter shooter, with even the publisher weighing in and talking about the game being pretty much a major disappointment. Especially with comparisons made to the other majorly successful Harry Potter action-adventure title by Warner Bros. But Suicide Squad had one last ace up their sleeve. Joker. Season 1 would hit March 25th and would not only introduce the long-awaited and much-loved Joker with the new character, there would also be some new missions unlocked in new areas, which are largely rehashes of previous levels, some new enemies, and a new boss fight. The most bizarre thing about the Season 1 update, though, was that Joker had to be unlocked by grinding above level 30 in the game. The way you would grind was by taking on incursions, which you had to pay for, which were basically repeatable missions in familiar locations with familiar monsters, rinse and repeat. The only way to circumvent this process was paying $10 outright for Joker. And while much of this might sound like it's standard fare, the issue with live service games is that their updates almost always seem to be set in stone. Like they can't update or change things even when they know that people probably aren't really going to receive them very well. People already didn't like the endgame, so having to do it again was just highlighting it as more of an issue. I think that's what happened with Season 1. It's an okay update, but one that makes no sense in the context of the game's launch and its reception. A major issue at launch, and still existing even after Season 1, and was, as Paul Tassi of Forbes put it, was that the game still needed content. Actual, new content. This seems like extremely basic stuff. One of the biggest complaints about the base game was that there's not enough variety in activities, as side missions, main missions, and in-game missions were all the same blend of rooftop hopping, and the same objectives. That has not changed at all in the Joker season, and in fact, I feel actively misled about that. The promised new strongholds Rocksteady talked about were revealed to be nothing but the old one-off missions from after the story campaign that are now back with Joker paint on them. And while there are new in-game incursions, they are the old incursions but with objectives like kill 150 enemies, which no, I'm not going to consider that new content. And he had a fair point, which goes along with my launching content in a vacuum point too. With a very poor reception for a major season update cancellation is very possible. Although there might be a roadmap in place, AAA companies have shown their willingness to throw all of those out together when the product fails. It is very likely that Rocksteady, or what's left of them, and Warner Brothers might just cut their losses and do another one of those copy-paste corporate Twitter posts. It took Marvel Avengers under 2 years to go down, and Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League had far more controversy, leading to it potentially going down sooner. Now, this is speculation, but I think a fair point to argue is that the expectations of the title were never fully met, and we likely won't ever see them pump in any significant effort going forward to fix that, effectively meaning that the game is just slowly dying. With the music playing, this mystery has largely come to an end. We have reached current time on the timeline and obtained well than enough clues to solve this thing, so what are the largest contributing factors for the Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League's failure? It was overpriced and underdelivered. Incredibly poor public perception surrounding it. Rocksteady was just not in their bag. It had more live service crap. It angered loyal fans of the series. The last point might come as a bit of a surprise to those not following the story or waiting for me to lead the way. Kevin Conroy, the voice of Batman, lent his legendary voice to the Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. For many fans, this felt like a slap in the face on top of things, especially when the story in Suicide Squad was reportedly canon. This is pretty emotional, but some fans kind of feel like because this is Kevin's last project and he just recently passed, they kind of wanted like a really good memory of him, a last good memory. I mention this as a reason for the game's failure because it's a very commonly mentioned reason that fans don't like the project, not to mention the usage of the voice of Batman, period. As I mentioned in my Marvel Avengers video, Marvel or DC fans can be quite dedicated, and if they feel like something's not being represented very well due to extensive experience with comics and the story, they will let you know, painfully, and that kind of applies to any major fandom to be fair. Rocksteady just didn't do a good job of courting this player base and audience, and this heavily contributed to the game's poor reception and perception. But with that, we have reached the end, detectives. I must leave the modern times and return to the world of virtual worlds on the next episode of Death of a Game.